Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome everyone, and thanks so much for joining. Today we have Dr. Sean Morrison presenting on the state of science in palliative care. Just a couple of reminders, you're muted and video cannot be turned on. However, we wish for you to engage with us by typing your comments in the chat and your questions in the Q&A feature, which is a button in your Zoom toolbar. Today, we also have Dr. Christine Ritchie, co-chair of the PCRC, and so I'd like to turn it over to her to please formally introduce our speaker.
And actually, this speaker does not require an introduction because most people, I think probably everybody in our field knows Sean Morrison, who is the chair of the Department of Geriatrics and Palliative Care at Mount Sinai, and also director of the National Palliative Research Center. With his advocacy and his work, honestly, I think he is responsible for much of the growth of palliative care research in our field. We're deeply indebted to him, and it's totally appropriate that he would be giving this last webinar for the PCRC. Thank you, Sean.
Oh, thank you, Christine, and just thank you for both the privilege and honor of doing this. Let me just start with a disclosure, which is I gave a substantial amount or portion of this talk at the PCRC meeting. So if you attended that meeting and you have something that's pressing or you would like to do in the next hour, feel free, because a lot of this is going to be repeat. Hopefully it's going to be better. Christine asked me to do this again. I think probably because it needed some improvement. So I used that as an opportunity to make some changes. So bear with me, and what we're going to do over the next, I guess, 45 minutes is really do three things. I want to walk through a little bit about the early state of the field and how we got to where we are. I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are in terms of the science of palliative care in 2023. And then I want to talk a little bit about what I see as our future, what I see as some of the things we need to do to get there, and hopefully leave you where I am, which is very optimistic and encouraged about the next 5 to 10 years. So let me go back to the beginning. And for those of you who are my age, you may remember this. But back in the early 1990s, palliative care really didn't exist in this country. And three things happened around the same time that really drove both public and professional attention to the needs of those living with serious illness and their families. The first was the rise of the assisted suicide movement and Jack Kevorkian. And for those of you who remember, Jack Kevorkian was a disbarred Michigan pathologist who would drive around in the back with a VW bus and hook you up to various chemicals, which would peacefully end your life. And it was such a statement that end-of-life care, or the fear of what was going to happen as you approach the end of life, was so great that you would rather die in the back of a VW bus with this sort of scary-looking gentleman than be treated in modern American healthcare. The second thing that happened was the AIDS epidemic. And suddenly, serious illness was not just the province of older adults, but it was affecting a huge number of younger and middle-aged adults in this country. It was a disease for many years. We had no effective treatments. We had no cure. And the suffering was very, very intense. And indeed, the symptom burden when it was compared to cancer was significantly greater than cancer. And then the final sort of part of this package was the publication of the SUPPORT trial, which was a randomized controlled trial to improve care for persons with serious illness. It was a $26 million study funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which looked at the quality of care and the experience of care and at 5 of the nation's leading academic hospitals, and demonstrated really intolerable levels of pain, poor communication, prolonged stays in intensive care units on ventilators. I think nothing that really was terribly surprising. And yet the fact that it was so common and in so many high profile institutions, it made the front page of the New York Times. And I guess it's probably not surprising that the experience of serious illness was so bad back then, almost 30 years ago. When we looked at the percentage of hospitals that had a palliative care team, it was less than 1%. There were only 5 academic medical centers in the United States that had a palliative care program back then: Mount Sinai, Mass General, Northwestern, the Cleveland Clinic, and Memorial Sloan Kettering. You can decide who has the nicest architecture. I can tell you who doesn't. It's that big, ugly brown building at the top. There were only 3 fellowship training programs in the country. There were only 3 programs who were truly producing physicians who had the knowledge and skills to care for people with serious illness. And there was almost absolutely no evidence base and no investment in the science of serious illness. Across the entire National Institutes of Health in 1995, there was only $3.2 million going to research focused on symptom management, communication in the setting of serious illness, and health services research. And to put that in perspective, that represented 0.025% of all NIH funding. And after support was published in the midst of the AIDS epidemic, and after Jack Kevorkian was making more and more headlines, the Institute of Medicine convened its first report looking at the experience of serious illness. And you can tell how dated this was because it was really exclusively focused, quote unquote, on end of life care, as if we had a way of actually defining when somebody was dying and at the end of life. And the conclusions from that IOM report in 1997 were pretty damning. Too many people with serious illness suffer needlessly. Most experience inadequately treated symptoms, fragmented care, poor communication, and very, very high strains on their family. There are legal, organizational, and economic obstacles that obstruct reliably excellent palliative care. That our healthcare training was failing to provide healthcare professionals with the necessary knowledge and skills that are required to care for the serious ill, and that the knowledge base was completely inadequate to support the evidence-based palliative care clinical practice that I would argue all patients and families deserve. And what happened? Where are we 25 years later? Well, we're actually not in a bad place. I mean, the last time CAPC and NPCRC looked at these data, 72% of all hospitals in the United States reported a palliative care team back in 2019. In 2015, every single academic medical center in the United States reported a palliative care team, 100%. So whereas all of us would argue that we're not seeing enough patients in our institutions, at least we're at the point where we've put, sort of stakes in the ground, and we can say that 80%, for example, of Medicare descendants have, in theory, access to palliative care. Again, back in 2019, when we did the last state-by-state report card, 75% of states had an A grade, which meant that 80% of their hospitals had a palliative care team. Pretty damn good. Look what's happened in terms of training, and I apologize for the other members of the IDT who are on this call. It is really hard to get similar data around nursing, nurse practitioner, and social work training in palliative care. But if we look at palliative medicine, we now have 156 palliative medicine fellowship programs in the United States. You know, think about that. That is about a 30% or 30-fold increase in the number of palliative care fellows, not programs, we had back in 1995. And we have over 8,000 board-certified palliative medicine physicians, and it is a nice linear increase that keeps increasing and over time. And with the exception of hospital medicine, it's the most rapidly growing specialty in the United States. Still, there will never be enough board-certified palliative medicine physicians to care for everybody with serious illness, but we're making a dent in that direction. And then finally, we now are seeing $22.7 million in NIH funding. And in fact, the percentage of NIH funding has doubled over the past 30 years. And that's the good news. The bad news is it still is less than 1% of all research funding at the National Institutes of Health. I would suggest we have a ways to go there. So how did we get here? And how did we get the field to where it is? And it didn't occur by accident. What happened was money, and indeed, unlike almost every other area of medicine, in fact, I would say unlike any other area in medicine, the money came from private sector philanthropy. There was a very clear and visionary strategy from early leaders in the field of academic palliative care that looked at the landscape and decided, how are we going to get to where we need to be? And we were incredibly fortunate to have some of the brightest and strongest leaders in healthcare who took this on as a mission to drive this forward. So where did the money come from? Well, overwhelmingly, the money came from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Open Society Institute, George Soros, who put several $100 million into healthcare to improve care for people with serious illness. There was a substantial investment from the National Institute on Nursing Research, who became one of the early leaders in creating the field and the science at NIH, and some philanthropic money from the Kornfeld Foundation, which I put here not because so much the money pales in comparison to what RWJ and Open Society put into the field. But what was interesting was Kornfeld became one of the very few foundations that was willing to invest heavily in science and research in our field. We also benefited from a group of leaders who were social entrepreneurs. And what is social entrepreneurship? And I put this up here because I think we are going to need this for the next stage of creating the science in serious illness care. It's recognizing that the status quo is broken. It's stable, however, and yet it's unjust and inadequate. Essentially, the status quo is not working, but unless somebody does something, it's going to continue. It's about envisioning a new approach that will fundamentally alter that status quo. It's about developing innovations and prototypes, and it's about promoting the adoption of tested models so that the new approach supplants the former. And the social entrepreneurs in palliative care developed a strategy that was both top-down and bottom-up. The top-down strategy was to think about, can we create a supportive environment through the media, through accreditation, through policy, regulation, and research and education that will provide the climate for palliative care to effectively build itself up. And if you don't have, even if you have a supportive climate, if you don't have an evidence base, if you don't have a workforce, if you don't have capacity, you know, the most supportive environment in the world is not going to create the field. And so the second piece of this was a bottom-up strategy that was focused at much more of the individual level of creating capacity, creating science, and creating programs that would benefit from the supportive environment. And there were some guiding principles, focusing on what was scalable and has low unit costs. And the reason for this is we were a relatively small field. You want to reduce opportunity costs, and you don't want people throughout the country reinventing the wheel. I think what was critically important to our success was aligning with the prevailing culture and infrastructure, and then planning for integration. And I want to distinguish this a little bit. We've seen hospice as a model for care that has, worked and has developed over, since the Connecticut Hospice in 1972 up until now. But I would suggest that the first 20, 25, 30 years of hospice, it was a countercultural, isolated movement. And I think that hurt us. It was about creating a unified community that spoke with one voice and didn't form a circular firing squad. And it was also about creating long-term sustainability. So let me talk a little bit about 3 case studies. One is around clinical infrastructure. The other is around academic palliative care. And the third is around the science of palliative care. So let's talk about what happened with the clinical infrastructure. And let me start with the money. The money came from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the gentleman at the left bottom of your screen, who is Steve Schroeder. Steve was the president of RWJ, and he was the president when RWJ funded the support program. And when support was published, and when support demonstrated how poor care for people with serious illness was in the United States, RWJ could have done one of 2 things. They could have said, we did the study, we did our work, we're going to move on to something else. Or they could do what Dr. Schroeder did, which he said was fix it. And having invested $26 million into trying to fix it and not seeing success, RWJ went and then spent hundreds of millions of dollars to try and fix it. One of the people charged with how RWJ was going to spend the money was a woman named Rosemary Gibson, who is a senior program officer at RWJ. She's the woman up in the top right-hand corner. Rosemary had the idea, she had a number of brilliant ideas, but I think her most brilliant idea was to set up a national program office that would serve to provide technical assistance for hospitals and health systems who wanted to build palliative care programs. And she brought that idea of the Center to Advance Palliative Care to 2 people at Mount Sinai, Chris Castle, who happened to be my chair there at the time, and Diane Meyer, who had excuse me, been one of the creators of the palliative care program at Mount Sinai. And Diane and Chris took the Center to Advance Palliative Care and basically scaled clinical palliative care throughout the United States. They focused on really doing 4 things. One is creating a business case and making it both about quality, but also about cost, and demonstrating to both to hospital CEOs and hospital CFOs that palliative care was high value care. I think one of Diane's most brilliant contributions to the field was around messaging and redefining what we do so that it resonated with patients and families, and moved what we were doing, which was quote unquote, improving care of the dying and improving end of life care, to improving quality of life for people with serious illness. Because folks, given the choice between living better with a serious illness or having a better death, I can't tell you, or I can tell you, what most Americans would choose. They developed tools and technical assistance, again, so that nobody had to reinvent the wheel. If you wanted to start a palliative care program in your hospital, you had a business case, you had marketing materials, you had advertising, you had policies and procedures that you could download from the CAPC website and just insert the name of your institution, and they built a community. A lot of work building a community and making people feel like they weren't working in isolation across the United States. Second case study, I think, was around building an academic field, and where RWJ was building the clinical capacity. One of the things that the Project on Death in America, which was funded by George Soros on the bottom right, did was essentially create the field of academic palliative care. Kathy Foley in the middle probably needs no introduction, led the Project on Death in America, and Susan Block on the woman on the left, again, somebody who needs absolutely no introduction to this field, created what was called the Faculty Scholars Program under PDIA. And what the Faculty Scholars Program was designed to do was essentially to create leaders in academic medical centers who would be the role models, the mentors, the teachers, and the leaders for palliative care, where all of our people train, where the science is created, and really the intellectual home of palliative care. One of the challenges that happened at that time was that academic palliative care was really working in isolation and really not part of mainstream palliative care. It's hard to imagine right now, but back in, I guess, 2002, where many of us in academic medicine met at a PDIA retreat and basically sketched out what needed to happen in terms of clinical care, academic health, and research over the next 10 years. There had never been a president of AHPM, the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine, who was an academic physician. And we realized that if we were going to create a field, we needed to do it from the inside. And Jim Cleary, God bless him, ran for president and won. The next year, Bob Arnold ran for president and won. And I think it was Bob, and Jean, correct me if I'm wrong, established a new organization with funding from PDIA inside the academy called the College of Palliative Care, which was focused on developing the academic field of palliative care. And Gene Kuttner, no introduction needed, was the first president of that organization. The other thing that developed out of that meeting was the recognition that we needed to be an official subspecialty, that we were not going to be recognized in healthcare unless we were a true subspecialty. And Charles von Gutten, Top Wright, and Russell Portnoy took on the task of creating a specialty of palliative medicine. And literally in record time, no specialty has gone from non-specialty status to specialty status as fast as palliative medicine did, went to become an official subspecialty of what makes sense: internal medicine, family medicine, and pediatrics, but also 8 additional other boards at the American Academy of Medical Specialties. Again, this idea about driven by leadership, integrating into mainstream healthcare, taking advantage of philanthropic funding, and a clear strategic vision about how we're going to get there. And then finally, we did an amazing job in terms of, I would say, creating an academic field, clinical programs, and yet the evidence base and the science for what we were doing needed improvement, and needed, again, a jump start. Fortunately, we had leadership at the National Institutes of Health. Back in the late 90s, Patricia Grady, the woman in the top left, was the director of the National Institute of Nursing Research, and identified, because of a conference that NINR sponsored, the need for improvement in care for people living with serious illness. Dr. Grady got NINR to be assigned as the institute that was going to house the first Office of End-of-Life and Palliative Care Research. And she appointed the woman on the bottom right, Alexis Bakos, who many of you know, to be the director of the Office of End-of-Life and Palliative Care Research. And one of the first things that they did was to create and to organize the first NIH State of the Science Conference on palliative care. And this was also done very strategically. There was a planning committee, and that planning committee was comprised of a number of early leaders and NIH-funded investigators in palliative care. You can see the names there. What I want to draw your attention to is the red names, because the red names were people who were PDIA faculty scholars. And so you can see that the planning committee, which selected the presenters, was heavily influenced by PDIA faculty scholars. And that planning committee reached out and worked to bring in presenters who not only were superb scientists, not only were NIH-funded researchers, not only were good speakers, but were strategic thinkers as well, because we recognized that what would come out of this was going to help define how NINR operated their office and what their funding priorities would be, and would also be a roadmap for the next 10 to 15 years of science in this area. And it is not perhaps then a surprise what the recommendations were that came out. The first was to create a network of what they called at that time end-of-life investigators and well-defined cohorts of patients to facilitate coordinated interdisciplinary multi-site studies. It was to explore private partnerships, public-private partnerships related to serious illness research. and to enhance the training of a new generation of interdisciplinary scientists through mechanisms such as K awards, T32s, and R25s. And sometimes, as my mother used to say to me, I used to be a hockey goaltender, and the puck hit the post rather than going in the net. You've got to be good to be lucky, and lucky to be good. And I got really lucky. My mom also asked me at one point, as I was going to medical school, if I had just worked harder, would I have made the NHL, and did I have enough natural talent? And I told her, no, Mom, I did not have enough natural talent. You're going to have to be happy with a physician. So this was all about relationships. And how did NPCRC get formed? Well, NPCRC got formed because Bobby List, in the top left-hand corner, was running the Kornfeld Foundation, and through their experience in the science of ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, was looking around to think about what could a relatively small foundation do in palliative care or serious illness. Jim Block, bottom right-hand corner, former CEO of Johns Hopkins, among other jobs, was a consultant with the Kornfeld Foundation on a couple of grants that are projects that happened before that. And before that, he had worked with Rosemary Gibson at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Rosemary had introduced Jim to Diane Meyer through the Center to Advance Palliative Care, and Jim had been a CAPSI consultant. So when Bobby reached out to Jim, Jim knew about CAPSI and Diane, told Bobby about Mount Sinai. Bobby came to us, and since I happened to be the director of research for palliative care at Sinai, came up to me and said, you know, what type of proposal, what ideas do you guys have about promoting research in palliative care? And we gave her some ideas. She liked them. She gave us 1.5 years of a planning grant to come together and figure out what we could do. And we proposed to her the idea of a National Palliative Care Research Center. She and her board liked that and gave us our first grant of $2.5 million over 5 years to create NPCRC with really 4 goals. One is to create a new generation of scientific leaders, building on CAPSI's model, provide technical assistance to investigators so they could better compete for federal funding, and again, so they wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel, and to provide resources that at that time weren't available in their home institutions. To create roadmaps, like what happened at NINR, so that we could have very specific ideas and a clear plan as to what we needed to do to promote serious illness research across the lifespan, and to create a community of scientists who were focused on improving care for people with serious illness, because many people at that time were essentially an N of 1 program, working in relative isolation. I think we've had some success. And I just want to focus on a couple of the policy issues. The first was in terms of these research agendas, convening a group of experts to think about what is the state of the science in advanced dementia and how can we improve quality of life for people in advanced dementia, because the Alzheimer's Project Act, which is what NIA was basing all of their science and their funding decisions on, had excluded the population of people with advanced dementia and their caregivers from their scope of work. And we were able to get that population into NAPA. Once NAPA had a focus on advanced dementia and palliative care for advanced dementia, it was a relatively easy next step to collaborate with NIA to come up with a series of priorities for geriatric palliative care research, which then subsequently turned into a program announcement, which has been in existence since 2014 and has been repeated every year, and again was recently renewed. You know, two outstanding leaders, woman named Jean Kuttner, another woman named Amy Abernathy, came to us and said, you know, can you fund us a meeting where we can create a strategy to advance clinical trials in palliative care? And the outcome of that was this idea of forming a palliative care research cooperative, which lo and behold, NINR issued a program project grant or a center grant for exactly that, which Amy and Jean competed for and won, and that became the PCRC. And, you know, as all of you know, PCRC supports over 600 investigators across the United States. I'm still not willing to put past tense around support. I know. I think this is my issue with bereavement. You know, you're familiar with the technical assistance, you're familiar with the coordination, you're familiar with the research infrastructure, but the ability to suddenly transform the national landscape by providing that platform research was key to the growth and development of the field. And you can see that this has had an impact. You know, going back to 2001 to 2005, you can see that, you know, NCI, despite the fact that NINR was the lead institute, NCI, simply because of the magnitude of how much money they had, was the lead funding agency. But look what's happened over the past 20 years. You know, except for that little budget dip where the NIH budget crashed between 2006 and 2010, you know, we've seen a linear increase in funding in palliative care research, or better framed, research in serious illness, to the point now that, you know, if you look at the red bars on the right, it's about $300 million in funding we're getting up to. And you can see that more and more institutes are getting into the game of funding research focused on serious illness. You can see the impact of PCRC and NPCRC. When we look at NPCRC grantees and PCRC members, they account for over half of the palliative care grants or serious illness grants funded between 2016 and 2020. They account for exactly half of R01s, R03s, R21s, and they account for nearly 60% of the K awards focused on serious illness. And then a couple of things happened which were some were unexpected, some were expected, but all of which I would say caused a little bit of stress in the field. We announced that we were sunsetting in 2025. NPCRC always was time limited. Initially, we were going to sunset in 2015 after a 10-year run, and decided, based upon surveys and where the field was at that time, to keep going. But the annual budget for NPCRC is $2.5 million. Its private sector philanthropy has invested close to $45 to $50 million in that center. And it's time. It's time for research to sit where it needs to sit, which is in sustainable funding structures such as NIH. You know, I think we're happy to think about a new type of center if somebody wants to come with $20 million, but those type of philanthropists aren't quite there now. What was a surprise a little bit was that NINR announced a new strategic plan that eliminated the Office of Palliative Care Research. Perhaps not a surprise. NINR is a very small institute. There is a lot of need out there, and they have led this for close to 15 to 20 years. Actually, I take that back, 20 to 25 years. It's time for somebody else to step in. And I think what was perhaps the big shock was the announcement that funding for the PCRC wasn't going to be renewed. And that, I think the timing of that could have been a little better. So one could feel like one was running at full force and hit a brick wall or a stone wall. Or one could look at the state of the field and say, boy, we really have an opportunity here, and the future is really, really bright. And that's how I'm looking at it. When we look back at 1997, research capacity in the field was, at best, 18 institutions who had an R01 funded investigator. When we look at 2022, that number is over 70. So there are over 70 institutions, not investigators, but over 70 institutions in the country who have somebody doing independent research in serious illness care. I showed that figure about how much MPCRC and PCRC contributed to research. Well, the other way of looking at that is that almost 50% of grants went to people who have absolutely nothing to do with us. 50% of R01s, R03s, and R21s went to investigators who weren't connected to either of these two organizations. And, over a third of K awards went to investigators who didn't receive funding or were part of our group. That's important. When we look at representation on study section, when we first looked at this in 2005, you couldn't get peer review at the National Institutes of Health for research focused on serious illness because there weren't investigators, R01 investigators, on study sections who were doing that review. I would argue now that you can actually get peer review, and that you don't, for the most part, have to explain what palliative care is or why palliative care is important for people with serious illness in your backgrounds and significance and innovation sections anymore. And you can actually spend some time on explaining the science of your grant rather than providing a general background. And I really do think it's time to think about spreading the responsibility for funding of serious illness research beyond that very, very small little pie slice at the top to institutes that also should be focused on people with serious illness who, quite honestly, have a lot more money. NINR's leadership in this field for an institute that small has been astounding. We need to think about others taking that up. And I would hope that NINR leadership are committed to helping to help build on their legacy and to bring the other institutes on board. So I would suggest that if you think about the diffusion of innovation S-curve, or you think about Malcolm Gladwell's tipping point, or if you think of Moore's crossing the chasm, we are right about here. I'm not sure that we have tipped, and I'm not sure that we're in that snowball phase where everything is going to be easy going downhill. But we're well past the early adopters, and I think what we as scientists need to do now is to get us just the other end of the chasm so we can tip. So what do we need to do? And this is Morrison's humble thoughts about what is it that we need to do. we need to speak with a common language. You know, there's a lot of words out there that describe what we do: serious illness, palliative care, survivorship, supportive care. My preference is we start talking exclusively about people living with serious illness and their families. That is the population, that is the group of people for whom our science needs to address. Palliative care is a field of healthcare. It's how we deliver the interventions to improve serious illness. So I think it has a place in our vocabulary, but it's probably not in our science. Survivorship, you know, some people survive, some people don't. Supportive care, you know, I'm sorry, folks, this one makes me crazy. What is supportive care? Anytime somebody says supportive care to me, I think I must be sitting, I think it's about a chair or a cane or a walker. The other thing I think we need to do is we need to start thinking about ourselves as scientists. You know, we talk about research, we talk about being investigators, but the language that we really need is the language of science, and I think it makes a difference. I think we need stable, permanent funding, organizational, and strategic homes. There needs to be a stable funding home for serious illness research, and research in this country, that home is the National Institutes of Health. And we need to be working on securing that. Our membership societies need to step up and become the organizational home for science. When you look around the country, ASCO serves as the organizational home for medical oncology. The American Geriatric Society has a huge focus on research and sits at the table with the National Institute on Aging. I can go through all of the membership societies. Ours is unique. Our medical society, our nursing society, and our social work society are all unique in that research is not well represented. And we as members of those societies need to change that. And we need to have our scientists sitting on the board. And we need to think about what is the role of disease organizations and charities, particularly around advocacy, particularly around lobbying, and indeed around supporting early stage investigators. I think we need to come together and create a new consensus research agenda and agree as a field what are our priorities, because there are still too few of us to be scattered all over the place, duplicating what others are doing, or in areas where we don't think that they are a strategic priority. And I think it's really critical that the work that these two organizations have done, MPCRC and PCRC, around funding, supporting, and providing a technical assistance for early stage investigators continue, because of the particular issues that our field faces. One is in medicine, that fellowships are only one-year clinical programs, and the very high teaching loads that early stage nurse investigators face if they are unfunded. And the unfortunate part that schools of nursing and departments of nursing often are reluctant to bring on people with K awards because the indirects for them are so low. And finally, you know, senior serious illness researchers may not be in clinical palliative care divisions, and we've got to think about how do we bring those in. And we need the next generation. We need that group of scientific leaders who are going to step forward, come in with their own ideas and strategies, and make this work. And you got to kick us old folks out of the way, because I'm not sure that many of us are going to leave until we get thrown out. So don't feel badly about doing that. And I want to close by just talking and bringing you all up to date about some things that have been done to prepare for this transition. The first is that AHPM is moving forward with the second State of the Science Conference, which in 2024 will bring together scientists working to improve care for people with serious illness and their families in one place and focus on the science of what we do. There is nothing that we can do which is better than supporting this process, going to this meeting, bringing our mentees to this meeting, and making sure that it is as successful as the program that Nick Dion and Abby Rosenberg ran virtually a year ago. We've got to do this because we need this to continue. We need to have the gathering point, the community building place that was the NPCR or the PCRC's annual meeting, and to a certain extent replicates the career development work of the Foley Retreat. Huge thanks to Peggy McGuire, who is, and Phil Rogers, both of whom co-chair the National Academy of Medicine's Roundtable, which is on quality care for people with serious illness, which for the past, I guess it's 4 years, maybe even longer, have run twice yearly workshops focused on key areas in the field of serious illness. And in November, the National Academies can be convening experts to identify and propose research priorities for our next 5 to 10 years. Many of you on this call will people will reach out to you. Sorry about that, folks. I'm trying to recap. Will be maybe reached out to be a speaker at that meeting. I would just encourage you to say yes, yes, yes. If we can make this as tight as we can, if we can make this clear as we can, if we can provide NIH with a roadmap moving forward, I think this will be as important as that initial NINR sponsored State of the Science Conference back in the late 1990s. And we have been really working on getting funding for serious illness research at NIH, dating back to 2011, where we got language into appropriations urging NIH to develop a trans-institute strategy for increasing funding in research and palliative care for persons living with chronic and advanced illness. And you can sort of read through this as I talk. We came back in 2019. You know, timing on that was not ideal because, you know, even though this is a 2019 language, it actually comes into play the year before. You know, something happened in 2019, early 2020 that sort of made this lower on people's priorities. And then we went back in 2023 and asked them to do this again. Okay. Why I'm optimistic? This was the response in 2012 from NIH. This was the response in 2020 from NIH, sorry. This was the response in 2024. They sent back a 2.5-page single-space response identifying what they were doing, which required NIH to actually survey all of the institutes to figure out what they were doing. They outlined what the efforts were doing, and the bottom is what encourages me the most. Moving forward, NIA is leading efforts to convene subject matter experts from the ICOs listed above to expand and intensify the strategic coordination of palliative care research efforts, as well as to identify future research topics and questions that pertain to palliative care. What that means is there is now one institute that is saying, we own this, we're going to lead, and it's going to be a group effort. And yes, there's an A at the end of that name, but I know that NIA has been working really closely with NICHD. So this is going to go both across the lifespan and across diseases. I'm really optimistic. Last week, two major coalitions, the Patient Quality of Life Coalition, which represents over 40 disease-specific and advocacy organizations in the United States, and the National Coalition for Hospice and Palliative Care, which represents all of the major palliative care organizations, with technical assistance from NIA and NIH, and with the support of two major senators, put in language to the Appropriations Committee, replacing the language that you just saw, requesting $12.5 million in next year's budget to actually implement what you just saw on that previous slide. Who knows if it will take this year, but I think we are really at a great place. And I will leave you with one question, which is, what are you going to do? At the beginning of this talk, I titled it The Beginning of the End. No, I titled it The End of the Beginning. And the reason for that is a quote from Churchill. This comes back to World War II, 1942, where England basically stood alone against Nazi Germany. And it had been a series of defeat after defeat after defeat after defeat, until General Montgomery had a major victory over Rommel's German forces in Africa. And Churchill went on the radio to rally the country. And what he said was, now this is not the end, and it is not for us. It's not even the beginning to the end. We have some work to do, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. And I really look forward to working with you for the rest of that beginning. And again, thank you so much for the truly honor and the privilege of being the last PCRC webinar. I am very cautiously optimistic that although the PCRC may not continue in its present form, it is going to continue in a different form, and that the work that it has done over the past X number of years is going to continue better than ever. And I will stop there.
And everybody.
Thank you so much, Sean. And also just want to communicate as well our deep thanks to the National Institute for Nursing Research. This would not have been possible. None of this would have been possible without their vision from the very beginning, as you got to hear from Sean. And they have really created the infusion of energy that this work has needed. And Sean, of course, we're very grateful for you and for all of the work that continues to happen, each person on this call or Zoom, and all the work that's coming forward. And I agree with Sean, this is not the end. This is just the end of the beginning. We have so much amazing work ahead of us. And we do want to communicate on behalf of Jean Kuttner and Catherine and myself how much we've appreciated this community and each of you. Have a great rest of the day.